The year 2022 was a saga. It began with a deadly surge of COVID-19 activity and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, dashing decades of hard-fought progress for reproductive freedom. We farewelled Britain's longest-serving monarch and witnessed her returning to a mission to the moon. The past 12 months of the year 2022 have been packed with action. In All 24 News Special, we will recap some of the biggest events and stories with our panel of distinguished guests shortly. Hello there and welcome to the program. Before we delve into any further details regarding today's special review of the year 2022, here's the President's message to the people on the occasion of the New Year.
يسعدني ونحن نودع سنة 2022 بما حملته من أحداث وقرارات من مؤشرات إيجابية وتحسين الأوضاع الاجتماعية والاقتصادية وبعزيمة كل الجزائريات والجزائريين. وها هو يحل علينا عام جديد نتمناه أفضل من العام الذي مضى من كل الجوانب، وأن تتجسد فيه أمان الشعب الجزائري برمته ومواصلة التغيير نحو الأفضل، وأن تكون سنة 2023 أيضا سنة تتسارع فيها الاستثمارات وتتراكم فيها الخيرات، وأن ترتقي فيها بلادنا إلى مستوى أعلى. وبهذه المناسبة أتمنى لكم ولكن عاما سعيدا لكل الشعب الجزائري، دون أن ننسى جاليتنا في المهجر. كل عام وأنتم وأنتن بخير.
And that was the President of the Republic of Algeria. So first main events we're going to be discussing in today's special concerns the Arab world and Algeria. And before we bring in our guests, let me invite you to watch this report on the Arab Summit, which was held in Algiers under the theme Summit of Reunification after the Palestinian faction signed the Algiers Declaration, an opportunity to strengthen Arab solidarity and joint Arab action. The report is signed by Mariam Zian. Let's follow.
The Arab world has witnessed divisions and discord for many years, but the year 2022 was a reminder for Arabs that unification is their strength in this fast-changing world. One of the most marking moments of the year was when Algeria hosted the Palestinian factions in October and succeeded in gathering them in a great step towards intra-Palestinian reconciliation. The Palestinian factions reunion initiative was hailed by many countries and described as historic.
برعاية وإشراف من السيد عبد المجيد تبون رئيس الجمهورية.
Another milestone was the return of the Arab Summit, which was held in Algeria after a 3-year absence due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Summit of the League of Arab States was held in early November and was under the theme Unification for the Arab Ranks. This conference concluded with the adoption of the Algiers Declaration, a declaration that listed all the matters discussed at the meetings and on which all participants agreed. The priority files being Palestine, Libya, Yemen and Syria, and insistence on the rejection of any form of foreign interference in the internal affairs of Arab countries and attachment to the principle of Arab solutions to Arab problems. The summit also addressed for the first time some issues such as water, energy and food security, as well as climate change. The consensus on all social, economic, and political issues affecting the Arab region has characterized this Arab milestone. The unification of the Palestinian factions and the return of the Arab Summit were one of the most significant events in the last 12 months for the Arab region, with an Algerian diplomacy that played a pivotal role in the region.
All right, let's bring in our guest. Joining me here in studio is Mr. Shuaib Boutamin, Oil and Gas Advisor and CEO of Rana Drill. Thank you, Mr. Shuaib Boutamin, for agreeing to be with us here in studio. And from USA is Dr. Hamoud Salhi, Associate Dean Professor of International Education at California University. And from Palestine is Mr. Steve Sossaby, President Founder at Palestine Children's Relief Fund. And from Italy is Mr. Mark William Lowe, International Relations Expert and Geopolitical Analyst. Thank you all for agreeing to be with us indeed. Of course, we will bring in other guests gradually as we develop the main events of the year 2022 in the coming chapters. But first, let me start with you, Dr. Hamoud Salhi. In what way is the Arab Summit an important event in Algeria, and how successful was it? How is unified Arab world geopolitically strategic for the Arabs in general and for Palestinians in particular? And how important is the Algiers Declaration for that matter?
I think if we put it in a larger perspective, let's not forget this was a summit meeting that was not supposed to happen for obvious reason. The Arab world was divided. The normalization with the Israelis was making headway on many levels. And Algeria was seen as a country that is leaning towards other position that was not going to be successful in gathering the summit or the Arabs in the summit. That proved to be wrong for the obvious reason. One, Algeria diplomacy proved to be successful, played a major role in representing, in bringing all Arab leaders to the summit meeting. Those who did not attend it, and for the history, have had, usually they don't attend this Arab summit. So, and
no
the vast majority of the Arab leaders were here. And then I think what was the most important about the event is what came after it. Like, for example, there was a lot of pressure on some Gulf countries to normalize relations with Israel. That has changed tremendously in the past few months because in part of the oil revenues, but more than anything else, because of the environment that was set in Algiers, which sent a strong message that normalization was not accepted by the Arab world. The statement, the communique, the Algiers communique, underscored the importance of putting the Palestinian cause at the core of the issues that face the Arab world. And in that perspective, the Algiers was successful. In looking at it further down the road, we see, for example, the Palestinians very aggressive in promoting in the international system. The Arab world, for example, is also managing some conflicts, like in Syria and in Libya. So we're seeing some development in that area. Now, typically, we expect more of the Arab
And
leaders.
Dr. Hamoud Salhi, speaking of the role of Algeria, how important is this role that Algeria is playing regionally? Take, for example, the Sahel region in general, and Mali and Libya in particular.
It's a very, very important role. And again, because of the credibility of the Algerian diplomacy, it has shown over the years that Algerians are masterful in bringing parties together. And the key to the success is always putting the national reconciliation or bringing all factions from different perspectives without interfering, providing an environment for them to discuss without external interference. Second, when we look at the issue of Libyan, not long ago, Algeria was blamed for not interfering in the internal business of Libya. That proved to be the wrong approach. For now, the Libyans are looking for resolutions internally, bringing a national reconciliation. You go to Mali. Mali has adopted the Algerian National Reconciliation Charter as a framework for resolving its conflict. That issue is on the table today. So what makes the Algerian diplomacy successful is that kind of principle that that's holding to it, and then it is also marked by positive results.
Right.
We have seen many cases where Algeria's role was instrumental in bringing all parties together.
Excellent. And Mr. Maklo, how do you see the role Algeria is playing at the Arab level and its unwavering support to the just Palestinian cause? Do you see a unified Arab world without a lasting solution to the Palestinian cause, say, for instance, in Western Sahara, for that matter, is not going to happen? Mr. Maklo? Yes, Mr. Maklo, I was saying that the role of Algeria is important. Can you shed the light how it is important when it comes to the Palestinian cause, for that matter, for instance?
I think that we have to make some observations on both a positive and a negative front. First and foremost, on the positive side, we have the fact that Algiers is once again back on the international stage. By hosting this very important summit, Algiers has demonstrated that the country has entered a new chapter in its history and is ready to take its role as a leader in the world. At the very same time, however, the Arab League has a number of divisions that cannot be ignored at all, and most specifically as regards the Palestinian cause. So on the one hand, we have Algeria, which remains absolutely committed to the Palestinian cause. Algeria, which has, at the end of the summit, declared that the country will take leadership in promoting the full recognition of the Palestinian state at the United Nations.
Clear.
However difficult this will be, because we also have to remember that it's a long and hard road to travel, and especially because there are a number of nations that could object, that could vote against this, or could veto any similar proposal. But going back specifically to the Arab League, there is, as well as the Palestinian question, a very, very important issue, and it is the fact that a number of Gulf nations in particular have established formal relationships with Tel Aviv. And this is obviously due to the simple fact that our world is changing. We are indeed in a form of new world order.
Clear, Mr. Maklo. Let me please, yes, thank you. Let me just bring Mr. Steve Sossabi here to the conversation. What can you tell us, Mr. Steve Sossabi, about this political development of the Palestinian factions coming together? Does it bring any hope to Palestinians? And do you see the unity of the Arab world to solve their issue at the diplomatic level important, and could perhaps accelerate support to Palestinians suffering there?
Well, thank you, and Happy New Year, everyone. To answer your first question, we have a long way to go to see true unity on the ground here in Palestine reflected. What's happened in Algiers, which is obviously a very positive step forward for the Palestinian national movement, has not really translated into any actual unity on the ground here. I was just in Gaza 2 days ago. Gaza obviously is under the control of Hamas. Today was a large celebration on the part of Fatah in Gaza to celebrate their anniversary. And yet these two parties do not cooperate, they do not coordinate. I work in the humanitarian work in Palestine. We have 2 ministries of health. We have 2 ministries of education. We have 2 ministries of social affairs. It's a dysfunctional Palestinian national political representation that has yet to be resolved. Obviously, the summit in Algeria was a very positive step forward, but it has not translated into any significant change here politically on the ground. And regarding your question concerning Arab unity, of course, that's essential for any true movement on a diplomatic side to resolve the Palestinian crisis. But we all know that the true resolution can only come first by unity on the part of the Palestinians, and then real changes on the ground in Washington and in the European powers to finally recognize the true legitimate national rights of the Palestinian people. Arab unity is essential, it's critical, but nothing's going to change without Washington and the European Union making significant political and diplomatic changes in their Palestinians.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Shuaib Butamin, what are the prospects of a unified Arab world, let's say, economy-wise? What can the union of the Arab world have as an added value to world economy? I mean, if we can't come together politically, economically speaking, what are the prospects?
Yeah, agreed. I believe that the Arab world with very high, very important GDP, 2.8 trillion dollars. Russia is 1.6, Brazil is 1.7, 1.8. So this is a very, the Arab world is weighing heavily in the world market with 2.8 trillions. I think that the Arab world is playing a major role in the international scene at the moment, especially after the energetic crisis the world is living today. Let's highlight that we are living two crises. We have the energy crisis and we have the food crisis. We have a food outage around the world, and we have a spike in very high prices of oil and gas in the world. And the Arab world is adding an important value to the world market, and this is helping a lot. Algeria, for example, has really added really a good value by increasing its oil and gas production, and especially natural gas. And by the end of 2022, Algeria, I believe, reached 27 billion cubic meters of natural gas. This is a very good value. Qatar, for example, is increasing its investing, and in the upcoming few months and years will increase its natural gas production by 50%. Saudi, let's highlight that in the OPEC, the main countries of the OPEC are from the Arab world. Let's say Saudi Arabia is the first and the major producer of oil in the world by 12 million barrels per day. You have UAE with 4 million barrels per day. So the Arab world is playing very major role in the world.
Let alone when they come together, Mr. Shuaib. But I mean, of course, we will delve deeper into the statistics and the numbers in the next chapter. Let me just introduce it. Conflict raids and the killing of one of Palestine's most well-respected journalists, just some of the most important events to happen in Palestine in 2022. The United Nations declared the year to be the deadliest, let's say, for Palestinians in the occupied West Bank since 2006. Here's a report by our own Osama Ayadi, then we get back to discussion.
If the year 2022 has been smooth for some regions around the world, for Palestinians, it has seen many pivotal events and violent developments. The year 2022 was among the deadliest years for Palestinians in West Bank and other regions. The Zionist forces attempted to further tighten their grip on the Gaza Strip. The occupiers killed at least 49 people, including 17 children, as the warplanes of the invading entity had no mercy on Palestinians during their 3-day strikes in the already blockaded Strip. The killing of a Palestinian resistance leader was the first event that provoked the exchange of strikes between occupiers and resistance forces, which have shown more organized military resistance for Palestine and the creation of new brigades. Zionist entity also launched a military campaign called Break the Wave that has included near-daily raids, mass arrests and killings in the West Bank with a focus on Jenin and Nablus. The Zionist aggression was not limited to only one part of Palestinian citizens. The world has mourned one of the most famous and well-respected journalists in the region, and this concerns Al Jazeera senior journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, who was shot dead by Zionist bullets during her coverage of the occupiers' raids. The rise of the most far-right government in the history of the entity, which is not long in history, was not to pass just like some run-of-the-mill. The leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu and his government is well known for frequent incitement of violence against Palestinians. They have publicly stated their intentions to deepen illegal settlement building in the West Bank. What Palestinians witnessed during the year 2022 has been their lifestyle since the Nakba that left them living mourn every day and in every house. All these indications make us expect that there will be more targeting of Palestinians and the theft of more Palestinian lands. However, the only hope is to continue the Palestinian struggle for freedom and liberation.
Back to you, Dr. Hamoud Salhi. A Gaza Strip was attacked by Zionist warplanes for 3 days in early August, killing at least 49 Palestinians, including 17 children. There was considerable damage, let's say, in the Gaza as a whole, which has barely been rebuilt since the 11-day conflict of 2021. Why don't we see a strong outcry from the West as they do with Ukraine? Why do they turn a blind eye to Zionist atrocities and breaking of the law when they expand and settle and leave Palestinians suffering or brutally kill them?
I wish I had the answer, but it is obvious that the life of Palestinians does not mean much to some Westerners, and particularly the Western government or those who are in leadership position, and without any doubt to the Israelis and the Israeli government. This is a pattern that we have seen for decades. The Israelis have been able to get away with murder, and they have thrown away all international institutions aside, claiming that they are unfair, they have been treated, they are the victims. What's happening in Gaza, what happens to Shireen, what happens to many other thousands of Palestinians, to the wars that we have seen, quite often go unnoticed. But we need to emphasize a very important point, that the Palestinian resistance has grown over the years, and today one of the results or the consequences of this lack of respect for international law and for the Palestinians' dignity is the Palestinians are now, particularly the youth, looking and struggling or fighting against the Israelis in ways we haven't seen before, particularly the young generation. They are calling now no longer for a two-state solution, but more so for the entire Palestine. These are developments that sadly go unnoticed, and the international order, the national community, to a large degree, and by that I mean the Western media, the mainstream media. Let's not forget that the vast majority of the world community recognizes Palestine. Resolutions after resolution have passed by the United Nations General Assembly and some in the Security Council. All those point to the need to implement and to hold Israel accountable for its violation of Palestinians' rights.
Excellent. And let me bring now Mr. James Dorsey, geopolitical analyst and senior fellow at Middle East Institute NUS from Singapore. Mr. James Dorsey, many observers, diplomats and riot groups have expressed concern over Zionist use of excessive lethal force in the West Bank this year. How do you read the statistics yourself of these killings, and can we ever see this occupation being held accountable and punished for its atrocities, the latest of which is the killing of a veteran Al Jazeera journalist, and the authority refused even to launch a criminal investigation even?
What we're seeing is a spiraling of violence on both sides. On the one hand, you have Palestinian youth who clearly feel that the only way of trying to end the occupation or force an end to the occupation is more militancy and greater violence. And the Israelis are responding to that harshly and with violence. And as a result, in a sense, what you're seeing is that this occupation, and certainly not in this form, is unsustainable. I think in terms of what's going to happen is going to really depend on, we're entering a new phase with the most far-right, most ultra-religious government in Israeli history. What that means in practice remains to be seen. The government was just formed a day or two ago, but its statements certainly are not encouraging.
Yes.
And whether or not that sparks a different response to Israel by the international community, and particularly by the United States and Europe, is an open question.
Understood. For more insights, let me just bring in Mr. Steve Sosobi. Can you tell us about these reports that say attacks by Zionist settlers against Palestinians in the West Bank increased and became more brazen and coordinated in 2022? What's the situation like for Palestinians now there, Mr. Steve? How are families that lost their homes managing? And what about the children? Is the aid sent there enough? Is it reaching those families and children even?
Well, these are all valid questions. First, let's remember that the violence and the actions of the Israeli settlers, the illegal settlers in the occupied West Bank, is taking place with the protection of the Israeli military for the most part and Israeli security services. To answer your question concerning the international aid or aid that's coming to the families, they need security first and foremost. Obviously, they're living on land that they're constantly being attacked and brutalized by nearby settlements and by settlers running rampaging through their towns and villages without any protection. They don't have their own security services in these areas. They're in Area C, and therefore they're at the mercy of the Israeli security who's protecting the settlers. We've seen this violence increasing every year over the past several years, and it's only getting worse. And we can only
Speaking of violence, Mr. Sosobi, are we expecting more violence in Palestine with the coming of this new government? I mean, what's the feeling there like? I mean, are they expecting this violence to increase? And what can we do more to help Palestinian citizens trapped, I mean, in this conflict?
I think there's a great feeling of trepidation and fear on the part of the Palestinians here as to what this new government in Israel is going to do. We've all heard their statements of these now ministers when they sat in different positions in Israeli political life, most of them expressing extreme positions concerning the relations with the Arabs and the Palestinians. And therefore, the Palestinians here are very fearful that the situation is only going to get a bad situation or a terrible situation here in the occupied territories is only going to get worse, particularly in the Gaza Strip. Therefore, they're asking and requesting for international protection, international support, and the implementation of international law here in the occupied territory.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mr. Steve Sosobi, for being with us and for your contribution. Much appreciated. And dear viewers, don't go anywhere, as it's time to discuss the next topical event of the year. But first, let's follow the report by our own Hussam Barkan on the Russia-Ukraine file, and we get back.
Il est très stable, ce
Under the title of Special Military Operation used by Vladimir Putin, Russian troops carried out their offense on February 24. Several major cities suffered bombing, such as Kharkiv, the second most populous metropolis. Within few days, Russian troops captured the region and city of Kherson, a strategic point in the south. The Russian offensive was relentlessly successful in the south, but in the north, it was met with fierce Ukrainian resistance. Ukraine managed to recover large areas around the capital. At the beginning of April, Russia abandoned its advancement toward Kiev, withdrew from the north, and focused its efforts on controlling the east and the south of the country. Since the end of spring, the main battles have been concentrated on the Donbas area, in conflict since 2014. At the end of September, Putin announced the annexation of around 15% of Ukraine, including Donetsk and Luhansk regions, as well as Zaporozhye and Kherson in the south, after a referendum widely questioned by the international community. In mid-September, Ukraine claimed to have recaptured the cities of Izium and Kupiansk, east of Kharkiv, two logistics centers used by Russia to supply its Donbas troops. The onset of winter has slowed down Ukrainian operations on the ground, which are now waiting for more Western weapons. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine has entered its 10th month so far, with no end in sight. It is a conflict that has had major repercussions around the world, with millions of refugees prompting a cost of living crisis with soaring energy and food bills, as well as millions of refugees fleeing Ukraine. The conflict has also contributed to spiraling inflation and a decline in the purchasing power around the world. Before the conflict, around 40% of Europe's gas supplies came from Russia. In response to Western sanctions, Russia has reduced gas supplies to a trickle, forcing energy prices on the international market to shoot up to record levels. Europe, in turn, has been trying since then to reach a consensus to put a price cap on Russian energy.
All right, let me welcome Mr. Christopher Isidju, Foreign Affairs Analyst and a writer, who's joining us live from USA. Thank you so much, Mr. Christopher, for agreeing to be with us.
Hi, thank you, Frank. Thank you very much for having me. Happy New Year's.
Thank you, and Happy New Year for you too. Mr. Chris, even before Russia-Ukraine war, months of growing tensions hinted at the risk of a conflict in Europe. But there was little sense of just how consequential and protracted, let's say, the fighting would become. How did we get here even, and were we able to avoid this altogether? What did the West fail in or miss? And how can the West catch up on the repercussions that are felt globally?
Sure, that's a very good question. I think it's a broad question, but I think I would start by saying that how we got here is because of one man and his regime, and that is of course Vladimir Putin, who many could consider now a war criminal, and really his illegal and barbaric invasion of Ukraine that he persecuted on February 24th was really how we got here. So I would really lay the blame for this square at the feet of Putin and the Kremlin and his regime. There are other factors, of course, that could have, maybe mitigated things or prevented him from attacking, certainly. But I would have to categorize it in one, with one responsibility being Russia's regime.
But could we have avoided this? I mean,
I think, I think we tried. I think at the end of the day, Putin made the decision to invade. However, if you remember, really the invasion goes back to 2014 when Russia first sort of stealth invaded and using the hybrid warfare tactics, originally invaded Ukraine and illegally annexed Crimea. However, I think that Putin definitely gave warning. He was building forces since basically the summer of 2021. And there were definitely, I think, steps where, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky definitely sued for peace. He emphasized many times he did not want war. He wanted to talk to Putin about peace. I think that the West did try to mitigate. The United States, President Biden gave a lot of warning to Putin. He warned about the sanctions. And I also think there's a lot of diplomacy, especially French President Emmanuel Macron. If you remember, there were several trips by him to visit the Kremlin in a sort of attempts at shuttle diplomacy. So I'm not sure if we could have avoided it, given that I think Vladimir Putin had made up his mind to invade Ukraine.
And what about the threat of the NATO expanding to his borders? I mean, that was the main reason, I think.
I think that's the reason that he chose to view. I think that the NATO expansion is a canard. It's a red herring on the part of Putin and the Kremlin. I think that if you look at Vladimir Putin's rhetoric going back as far as 2009, he was always looking to reestablish full Russian dominance and control of Ukraine. He famously said in 2009, Ukraine is not even a country. So I think the NATO expansion is really just an excuse for Putin to reassert what he views as the rightful Russian hegemony over Ukraine, which is, of course, a false narrative.
Mr. Christopher. Very nice. And Mr. James Dorsey, the war has created one of the largest human displacement crises in the world. This continuing conflict has led to a global cost of living crisis, with the price of commodities, including food items, fertilizers, and fuel, rising. Isn't it about time all this stopped? Is there any solution? Are we expecting this to linger on further even?
I don't see an end to the war anytime soon, unless you were to see a change in leadership either in Russia or in Ukraine. Fact of the matter is that I don't think the international community can allow the Russian invasion of Ukraine to stand. I don't see how either Russian President Vladimir Putin or Ukraine President Vladimir Zelensky can make concessions. This is for both of them a zero-sum game.
Clear.
And that makes a negotiated end to this very difficult.
Nice. What about you, Mr. Mark Lowe? Are the sanctions imposed on Russia by over 45 countries, for that matter, enough to stop the war? At what cost, that is? I mean, the West and Europe in particular have substantially felt the repercussions on their own, let's say, people. I mean, there was like military, financial, humanitarian aid they are providing to Ukraine. So all this is actually touching the pocket of the average European citizen.
And a very important question. So let's break it down into these two distinct fronts. One, can Russia, which if there was ever a prize for sanctions, then Russia would without doubt win the prize of being the most sanctioned against nation in the history of the universe. However, that said, Russia still has a number of options in regards to exporting a number of commodities, and specifically in the energy sector. So there are no lack of clients for Russian gas or for Russian oil. So Russia can continue to bring in revenue from the sale of oil and gas, sales perhaps to India, sales perhaps to China, sales perhaps to a number of other nations. So in terms of money coming in to state coffers, Russia can continue. Russia, Moscow has almost absolute control over the media and is therefore in a position to keep the Russian population as little or as badly informed as it wishes. So any fears of internal revolt, any fears of thoughts or actions that are enacted to try and oppose the invasion of Ukraine are very, very unlikely, to say the least. So yes, despite being about to take a rather important hit on its GDP, Russia will in any case continue to survive economically for some time yet. The second issue is how long will the European nations support Ukraine? How long will the United States of America continue to support Ukraine? So, as regards the United States of America, there is a huge commitment to military aid, and I see no reason why.
Mr. Mark Lowe, please stay with us, as I would like to raise this second question to Mr. Chris Isiju. Anything you want to add to what Mr. Mark Lowe has just said? I mean, what should we brace ourselves for? The war is yet to linger on further. Could there be a diplomatic solution, maybe, Mr. Christopher?
Yeah, I think that my colleague there had some very good points. I would say that, yes, that by all indications, we are in for a long war. The Pentagon and the United States, Great Britain, and many other of the Western allies have really committed to the provision of arms, but they're also currently building the capacity of Ukrainian forces. They're training thousands of Ukrainian servicemen in Britain and other places. So I think the tea leaves, if you will, are definitely pointing towards a protracted conflict. There could be a negotiated settlement if, in the sense that Putin saw that maybe he could somehow save face. I think Zelensky is willing to negotiate from the perspective of saving the lives of his people, although he will not cede any territory to Russia or anything like that. So under the present terms, no, there's no, as my colleague said very well, is no room to negotiate under the present circumstances. But perhaps if things change on the battlefield, if, as the Ukrainians are purportedly planning to do, if they took Crimea, the calculus for Vladimir Putin may change, or he may double down and try even more drastic measures voluntarily.
All right. Thanks for your time, Mr. Christopher Isiju, and your insights. Mr. Christopher Isiju, you were live with us from USA. And let me redirect this question to you, Mr. Shuaib Botamin. As we speak about the economic point of view here, how badly this war needs to stop, I mean, in order to, let's say, recover the world economy? And what's Europe's plan to steer away from the dependence on Russian energy? And what options do the West have? I mean, at least in the short, medium, and long term, perhaps.
Okay, perfect. This is a good question, I believe. I think this is what Europe is living today. There is a very complex equation, and problems are more than solutions. If allow me to just go to see the troubles, to go through the problems Europeans are living today, and to try to find a solution to this equation in short, medium, and long terms. The war started in last February between Russia and Ukraine, and weeks after weeks, Russia and the tension started rising between Europeans and Russia and the United States also. So the problem that the Russians, they were cutting gas sometimes, and it was like troubles between them. The solution, the issue they arrived to last July or August, when we had very, very short supplies of natural gas and oil also to the European Union. The European Union countries also decided to decrease their dependence, to decrease their reliance on natural resources, fossil energies, oil and gas from Russia. And just some weeks later, Nord Stream 1 is not delivering nothing of natural gas. And this is the big issue for Europe, and especially for Germany. So United States took a decision and action. The President Biden in the last March decided to release 180 million barrels of SPR, Strategic Petroleum Reserve of United States, on the way to alleviate the burden Europe is living. I think Europeans today are paying the cost of energy bill very expensive. They are paying the natural gas, the megawatt hour, reached in TTF in last summer, the 350 euros per megawatt hour.
Is this like 4 times the price, the regular price they used to take from Russia?
No, more. In the January 2021, the price of megawatt was like 20 or 30 euros. So the equation now is very difficult for Europe. And the major problem that complicated the problem, I believe, when they imposed a price cap on the oil and the Russian oil, 60 euros. And later on, some days later, they decided to cap also the natural gas with 180 euros per megawatt hour. This is a very complex situation Europeans are living in, and they are in deadlock situation. So just they decided in the beginning of December, by the end of December, the President Putin answered them and declared that he will not deliver any supplies of oil to European Union by February. I believe what will happen in the future, in the next few weeks now, Russians are developing what we call it a black fleet. It's like a black fleet. It's like some vessels, some tankers that will bring oil to another market, and we are creating a kind of speculations in the oil and gas. We are creating like a new traders of the oil and gas market. So instead that the state to deal with the state, in the future we are opening doors to speculators, and the Europeans may buy the oil and gas from a third party with a very
that is coming perhaps from Russia. Even.
Exactly, and a very high price. So I believe in the next 2-3 months, the oil prices will stay between 80 and 90, but I believe the Russians will make a structure of their fleets of tankers of oil and gas. I believe that oil and gas will go higher. If we go to the solutions of the European unions, they are investing a lot of money in the renewable energies. But the problem of renewable energies,
it takes time.
It takes time to make investment, and we need fossil energies to invest in renewable energies. And the problem of renewable energies, when we have troubles in weather, very bad weather conditions, as it's happening in the United States now, if you look at the wind turbines, you see they are stalled. They cannot turn. So they deliver at almost zero energy. So if the Europeans want to find best solutions in the next future, I think that they have to find a new providers of oil and gas. Because
Such as?
Sorry?
Such as? New
such
providers?
as third parties, I believe, or maybe Algeria. But you need investment. It's not really easy.
Yeah.
No country can replace the supplies of natural gas,
Because
for example,
it's very
Russia.
substantial.
More than 155 billion cubic meters of natural gas from Russia. So the situation in Europe now is very difficult.
Yes.
So the prices are surging and
Only time
spiking.
shall tell how perhaps we can solve this dilemma. Thank you so much, Mr. Shaib Boudami. Next up, the U.S. has expressed concern over Beijing's alignment with Moscow amid the ongoing invasion of Ukraine, and many are wondering if China and the U.S. are on collision course for war over Taiwan. What do we need to know about the U.S.-China rivalry in Africa, the Arab world, and Asia-Pacific when we come back after Nabil Khazini's report?
The year 2022 was particularly special in the Asia-Pacific region. It has been a quiet year in the political sphere and also in the Chinese streets. The world's second biggest economy, China, has completely shut down entire cities and locked millions of people in their homes under a strict zero-COVID policy to curb the high rise of COVID cases in a country of a population of 1.4 billion people. Such measures were quickly felt in countries heavily reliant on China, such as neighboring Thailand. However, such restrictions for others were not as important as the rising threat of a military confrontation in the Asia-Pacific. South Korea described a record-breaking run of weapons tests this year of North Korea as very grave and serious. This acceleration has alarmed Seoul and Washington, D.C., which called for further reinforcement of the South Korea-US security alliance. China was closely watching the kind of the undesirable American intervention in the region's affairs, but the visit of the former US Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan has so angered Beijing, which called the landing of the second in line in the US presidency on Taipei's airport as a major political provocation and a challenge to China's sovereignty.
China has fired multiple ballistic missiles during a set of military exercises in the air and the sea encircling Taiwan.
China now ramping up its show of force around Taiwan. China's military exercises around Taiwan now entering their 6th day.
The response was immediate from Beijing, which conducted live fire drills around Taiwan. Tensions over the island were feared to mount to a major escalation and consequently a war between China and the United States, especially after both countries' army were too close and where a misstep could lead to a direct confrontation between the two global superpowers. Therefore, a meeting of the two countries' leader was inevitable. Xi Jinping, who was elected for a third mandate as Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party in 2022, talked face-to-face with Joe Biden ahead of the G20 summit, in which they stressed the need to have a sense of responsibility for history and to put the US-China relationship on the right course. As the year 2022 approaches its end, so did the COVID restrictions in China. Beijing has announced an easing of its zero-COVID policy, following 3 years after it recorded the first case of COVID-19 in the world. In 2022, a series of events happened in the Asia-Pacific that has changed the political landscape in the region, with a Chinese influence in international affairs becoming more apparent and a scale of power starting to have a new balance.
Joining us live from China is Mrs. Zhang Shanghui, a journalist from CGTN, China. First of all, thank you, ma'am, for agreeing to be with us.
Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me, and Happy New Year to you all.
Happy New Year to you too. Mrs. Zhang, the Biden administration's U.S.-Africa strategy released in August starkly assesses that China views Africa as an important arena to challenge the rules-based international order, advance its own narrow commercial and geopolitical interests, undermine transparency and openness, and weaken U.S. relations with African peoples and governments. And of quote, how do you read this? Why is every Chinese engagement in Africa, the Arab world, and even Asia-Pacific the natural environment and region for China that is, are worrisome for the U.S.?
Thank you for this question. I would say that today China is kind of considered as an enemy or as a competitor, whereas this is not the intention of China by doing its business in Africa, by still building its ties with African countries. Because we can see that the Biden administration hosted the summit of African heads of state in Washington, D.C., and it is actually the first such meeting to be held since the Obama era. But the looming over the decision to host such a gathering in the first place is an obvious strategic intention, which means that the U.S. wants to contain the rise of China and wants to be there, to be present, more present in an African continent. But we need to come back a little bit by saying that why and how comes the China and Africa tie? The development of China and Africa tie is rooted actually in the global development, in the global South ties. So between in the last century, between the 15th and 16th, this period, China forged strongly bonds with many African countries.
Absolutely.
And still today, when we can see that how China and African countries have cooperated together, for example, some very concrete examples that I can find during my daily reports, when I talk to enterprises in Africa, when I talk to African ambassadors from different countries, what they are most impressed about China is the efficiency of undertaking a project. For example,
especially when it comes to infrastructure, I might add, actually, and it's been over actually 20 years. I mean, since many countries actually were trying to become independent, and China backed them up and helped them in many strategic projects and infrastructures.
Exactly. So here we can see that there is a kind of political issue and political common intention between China and also African countries, especially for this third world state recovering from the colonialism for the last century. And also it is very important to stress that China support African countries to find its own national sovereignty against the external interference. And we can also see that there are many projects being carried out, being terminated. For example, in March, the new terminal building of Nigeria's economic center and in the largest city of Lagos was built by a Chinese company. In March, the bridge, there's a big bridge called the Fankani Bridge in Senegal, which also undertaken by Chinese enterprises, was completed. The bridge with a total length of was 1,600 meter span over the Salam River. And there's also Mombasa-Nairobi railways.
So in short, Mrs. Zhang, China has far surpassed the U.S. as an economic partner for Africa, and now we're the Arab world.
We can say that today China is not a competitor as of America, of the U.S. in the whole African land. China is there to collaborating with African countries, and also there's a way that China tries to ties also with its friendship with African countries. So if the United States really wants to bring the change African aspires to have, it needs to sincerely collaborate with China and also listen to the needs and concerns of African nations themselves, instead of seeing the continent through the lens of its competition ways.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Shan Shankui. You were live with us from China. And here, let me address this question to Dr. Hamoud Salhi. How do you think the United States' rivalry with China will impact the Arab world in particular and Africa in general, knowing that most African and Arab countries desire good relations with both the United States and China, wanting to avoid fallout from major power rivalry?
Let me just underscore a few points before I get to the main subject. And if we go back a little bit and start to look at the war after the Ukraine war that now Vladimir Putin called it this way, what we've seen is emergence of a Cold War that centers particularly in three areas. You have one area in Europe where it appears, as we have seen so far, the Europeans have no strategy to address the conflict. They have yet to provide a strategic strategic solution that will bring the two parties, either the Russians and the Ukrainian, to resolve this conflict. And specifically, they appear fragmented. The position of the French, the position of the Germans and the British tend to be divisive and not united. Now, when you look at, that's one area where the conflict is going on, as we see the war. But it seems to me it's not as relevant or as important what we are seeing in the Pacific, particularly the conflict, the drilling, the recent meeting between the Russian and the Chinese president just over video, which stressed again the military or strategic cooperation between these two countries. We've seen now the emergence of a Cold War environment that involves countries like Japan, Korea, and the Philippines. So we're looking at emergencies of blocs. Connected to that, what Shaib was talking earlier about the economic also bloc that is emerging with the BRICS, that is becoming more influential, and particularly because it's the role that it plays to the national governments and the treatment of the banking system in or use of the national currencies. All this is designed, when you look at the African countries on the Arab world, designed in the eye of the Americans as a threat to their strategic goals. So anything they do, the Americans, vis-a-vis the Arab world, for example, or vis-a-vis the African, is designed to weaken China and Russia, not to benefit the people of that region. In the Arab world, what we've seen in the aftermath of this Ukrainian crisis, the rise in revenues has brought new players and has freed the Arab countries from their dependence on the United States. In particular, what the Saudis are doing in terms of expanding their relationships with the Chinese, signing strategic agreement with the Chinese, and more than anything else, what we've seen, the pressure the United States has been pushing on the Arab countries, particularly the countries in the Gulf, to normalize relationships with Israel is failing. Just as a point, as an example to illustrate this, the Omani Council just voted unanimously to ban any and to make it illegal to engage in any normalization with Israel. So what we are seeing is the impact of the Ukrainian war has given, and the rise of revenues for the energy has given ways for the Arab countries to detach themselves from the United States.
Excellent,
in the African
understood.
context, what the meager results that we have seen on the African-US meeting, barely $55 billion for in 3 years to be divided among the 49 countries attending, is like I don't know how to explain it in relation to what the Chinese have brought into Africa. So
yes, very nice. And to put that into perspective, Dr. Hamoud Salhi, excuse me to interrupt your thoughts. I would like to conclude this chapter with Mr. Shaib Boutamin. China is Africa's, let's say, largest two-way trading partner, hitting $254 billion in 2021. So, exceeding by a factor of 4 the US-Africa trade. China is the largest provider of foreign direct investment, supporting hundreds of thousands of African jobs. So this is roughly double the level of US foreign direct investment. What can you tell us about this strategic partner for Africa and the Arab world? And you told me earlier that you would like to say one thing or two about the conflict in Taiwan.
Yeah, exactly. I think we have been hearing for many decades about the Cold War. Today, I think it's warming up between the United States and China. Allow me to talk about the Taiwan. The problem is rising actually between United States and China. The core problem, I believe, is the semiconductors. Technology is available in Taiwan. Taiwan is producing more than 70% of semiconductors. It's delivering them to all the world. Those semiconductors enter in the satellite, in all the technology for the military uses, for electronics, for all. I believe that in the last few months, the United States President Biden has released $52 billion to TSMC. It's Taiwanese company producing the chips for computers. Yes. $52 billion. In the other side, China pledged more than $152 billion to attract the investment to China. So this is the main problem, I believe, between them. It's the problem of technology. Who will own the technology? There is a rival today between the United States and the European Union in one side, and China and Russia. The Americans, I think that they believe if China and Russia will own the technology available in Taiwan, I think they will make a change in this world.
Understood. Thank you so much, Mr. Shaib. But I mean, all right, next we will bring in human rights. In the year 2022 in focus, it was a year that witnessed widespread and systematic human rights violations and abuses against migrants, women and children due to war crimes, poverty and political turmoil. The report is signed by Zahra Farjani.
Dignity, freedom and justice are what each human being deserves in this life, regardless of race, language and religion or any other status. However, 2022 marked the violation of the most basic principles of human rights. Following the war in Ukraine, the world reached record levels of displacement. As of early December, approximately 7.8 million Ukrainians had been forced elsewhere on the continent. The situation in Myanmar was characterized by growing violence and insecurity, which resulted in an estimated 1,500,000 internally displaced people seeking refuge in neighboring countries. Many other ethnicities around the world saw migration as the ultimate solution for a better life, such as the Hispanic flows to the northern countries, escaping poverty and political upheaval in Latin America. Spain and Morocco are under the spotlight after the border crossing of the enclave of Melilla that resulted in the death of at least 37 migrants. International condemnation is growing against the two countries as new details emerge about the massacre and the treatment by law enforcement. The numerous human rights violations in 2022 did not stop at the migrant crisis. It also extended to basic norms. Women in Afghanistan are facing both the collapse of their rights and dreams as well as risks to their survival after the year-long ruling of Taliban. They see their future disappear with the ban of education and work. Thus, they had to react through strikes, refusing the ban. Women protesting was one sign of a human rights demand across the nations. In Iran, the death of Mahsa Amini had a huge impact on the world. The 22-year-old girl was arrested by Iran's morality police, severely beaten and dead in custody. This horrific incident erupted worldwide protests and condemnations. The escalations of these violations in 2022 brought calls for a change, for peace and an end to violence around the world.
Joining us live from the UK is Pippa Cartel. Thank you for agreeing to be with us, Mrs. Pippa.
Thank you very much for having me.
So in the case of the war in Ukraine, we saw how Europe immediately helped. But in the case of Ukrainians, there were early criticism on how other migrants were handled and discriminated against, such as the Syrians, the Afghans, who were left alone to deal with Taliban rule, or the African migrants, for that matter, shedding light once again on racism. In lighter scenarios, the countries receiving those migrants asked for fairer redistribution of migrants to other countries. The UK itself is struggling with the issue of migrants, and the last controversial measure to send them to Rwanda also stirred controversy. How do you read this situation? Should Western democracies be the only countries to bear the burden of migrants?
Well, Western countries aren't the only countries to bear the burden of migrants. If you look at the people who fled from Syria, for instance, the burden is largely borne by the countries immediately bordering upon Syria. Indeed, Jordan has a majority population of people who are displaced. In the UK, there is a massive furore over the number of asylum seekers here, and with the government inaccurately labelling them as illegal migrants. They're only illegal if their applications for asylum fail, which is a small percentage of them. And the number of them compared to other countries is actually pretty small. So the burden doesn't fall primarily upon rich countries, but they're very good at turning a blind eye to this kind of thing. They also need to think about, if you don't want migrants coming, then perhaps you need to make sure that the world is a stable, more happy, more peaceful place. You want to try and avoid the kinds of disruptions to economies that have led to conflict in other places, and some of which have been a result of interference in those countries, or indeed of climate change produced by actions in the West.
Very nice. And let me bring Mrs. Yvonne, who's also live with us from the UK. If we talk about the situation in Afghanistan, we saw that USA tried to impose, let's say, a certain way of life, lifestyle on a country that is completely different and has different traditions from, USA. They failed miserably, and they left those who adopted that lifestyle all alone in a Taliban rule. How did you receive the shocking footage of those who wanted to go with US staff and soldiers and fell from the airplane even? What does this symbolize, and what are these people, let's say, trying to flee?
I'm very conflicted about Afghanistan. I was there earlier this year, and there are lots of good things that are happening there that we don't hear about. It's much more safe. Crime has come right down. But on the other side, the rights of women are being reduced drastically. And far from improving after the decision to stop senior girls from going to school, they've now added a further restriction on female university students. And it's shocking. When the announcement came through, I spoke to several senior Taliban officials that I had engaged with when I was there earlier this year, and they were just as conflicted as me. One of them said to me, I have a daughter. What am I supposed to tell her? She wants to become a doctor when she's old enough, which would obviously mean a university education. Now, as far as his daughter can see, her dreams are being taken away from her by this regime. And I'm at a total loss over why they've done this. We keep on being told that it's a very misogynistic regime. But when I went there, I knocked on the door of every key ministry and got to see each minister, from the education minister, the further education minister, Ministry of the Interior, and said, why on earth are you denying girls education? I was assured this is temporary. And everyone I spoke to said, it's the postponement of the education. It's to change the curriculum, and it's temporary.
Very nice. And Mrs. Pippa Cartel, I go back to you. How do you see those who actually weaponize the migrants issue? If we take, for example, what happened in the Melilla enclave between Morocco and Spain, we see that every single time they are playing that card as a pressure card against Spain to, let's say, let them align with them in certain, let's say, policy.
Well, I don't think it's very helpful to turn the suffering of other people into a political football. It doesn't actually deal with the situation. It exacerbates the level of debate in home countries, it leads to tensions between countries, as you just rightly explained, and in the end, it reduces the civility and humanity of international politics. There are reasons why we have the UN Convention on Refugees. Now, of course, that was drawn up in 1951 in the aftermath of the Second World War, and it was envisaged for very particular circumstances. It wasn't drawn up for the kinds of circumstances we are now confronting. But that's not to say that it doesn't provide at least some kind of rule of thumb. And if you have a problem with it, then you need to come up with sensible ways of resolving these things, including cooperation between countries.
Excellent.
Over how you manage tensions rather than just going for conflict.
Pippa Cartel, Professor of History and Policy, University of Westminster. You were live with us from the UK. Thank you so much. And Mrs. Yvonne Ridley, Political Analyst and former Royal Palace Correspondent. You were live with us from the UK as well. Thank you so very much. Mr. Shuaib Boutamin, thank you as well for being with us. Dr. Hamoud Salhi, thank you so much for agreeing to be with us, and all our guests, James Dorsey and Mark Lowe, as well as Zhan Shenghui. I hope I didn't forget anyone. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. With this, our special coverage comes to an end, and Happy New Year. Take care. Happy New Year.